Well, we're just about 50 days away from kickoff in New Orleans, LSU against Florida State to open the Brian Kelly era. So, what are the betting trends? Why is this game so important for LSU? You probably think it's important, and I do too. And I'll break down all of that and more on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every day. I graduated from LSU in 2019, and I covered the team for several years, but now I am a Sports Talk radio host in Nashville, Tennessee. So we're just about 50 days away from Game 1 in the Dome, Florida State, LSU, to kick off the 2022 season. So why is this game so big? There are so many reasons, and I was listening to Josh Pate's Late Kick podcast. It's a great listen if you haven't checked it out. And he was breaking down the biggest swing games of September 2022. And this is what he had to say about LSU's matchup in September.
Each of these teams, if you think about it, each of them has that kind of 5% scenario where everything goes right and they win 9 games. That is in the cards. It's not likely, but there's a path where if everything went right for FSU or LSU and they just hit home runs all year, they'd go 9-3. That could happen. Point being, that's out the window automatically for whichever one of them loses this game. And it may not be likely for the winner, but it's certainly out of the cards for the loser. It's a bigger swing game for LSU, though.
It's a bigger swing game for LSU, and I have to agree for a few reasons. This is the first time that we'll get a peek behind the curtain of the Brian Kelly era. We don't know what to expect from this football team. One, the most obvious one is we don't know who the quarterback is going to be. But also because we don't know what a Brian Kelly coached LSU team is going to look like. We don't know if he's going to be able to turn around the woes of 2020 and 2021 and get this team back on track to be able to use all of the talent that past coaching staffs and this coaching staff has collected. We don't know what it's going to look like. So this Florida State game is so incredibly important because this starts the Brian Kelly era. There have been so many doubts about Brian Kelly ever since he was announced as head coach at LSU. I have my own doubts, you probably do too, and we've heard so many of them. Can he recruit in Louisiana? That's been a concern of a lot of fans that has kind of been re-upped over the past few days because so much of the 2023 recruiting class is made up of players from Georgia, Maryland, Indiana, so on and so forth. But over the past couple of days, he's raked up a few more Louisiana recruits. And I told y'all earlier this week, I said, do not panic. I've seen so many people panicking about how we can't recruit in Louisiana. But I think over the past couple of days, you've seen a few more players start to commit to LSU inside of Louisiana. And I'll break down all of those recruits on the next episode. But like I said, don't panic. Don't panic. It's only July. Don't panic. So I think that will kind of ease some of those fears, or also maybe solidify some of those fears of people if the beginning of the Brian Kelly era is a loss to a Florida State team that has been abysmal over the past couple of years. And Mike Norvell coach team, especially the past couple of years. Florida State has incredibly high expectations for their football team, similar to what we as LSU fans have for LSU, and they have fallen so short of that over the past couple of years. So I don't know if Mike Norvell is going to be able to turn around in year 3. And Max and Drake, the hosts of Locked On Seminoles, on the podcast a couple months ago. So you can go find that either on your preferred podcast platform or on YouTube as well, Locked On LSU. You can hear our full breakdown, my expectations and their expectations for the game. But they don't predict that Mike Norvell is going to be able to turn this ship around in year 3. They don't believe in Mike Norvell. So I understand that this is game 1 for Brian Kelly, and the stakes are incredibly high. And just, if let's say hypothetically LSU does not win this game. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be a crash and burn type of team under Brian Kelly. It doesn't mean that. But winning this game is huge because you're going to start to silence doubters. You're going to show people, hey, no, you can win games. And I think another big part of this too is, like Josh Pate mentioned, LSU could have a 9-3 season. I don't know. I go back to I don't know what to expect from this team. 9-3, I think, is kind of shooting for the stars. You know, a 9-win, 10-win season, while possible, very much so. I'm not expecting that. I think the sports books have LSU listed at over under 6 wins, 6.5 wins. I think 7. While that doesn't sound like a fantastic season, a 7-5 season definitely is not reaching our expectations. Looking at LSU's schedule, 7-5 doesn't seem that out of the cards. And if LSU does go 7-5 this year, but they show flashes of improvement and it makes you feel good about the next coming years. For example, Tennessee went 7-5 this past year, and I think Vol fans are more fired up and excited about Tennessee football than they ever have been, because even though they did go 7-5, that was an offense that looked unstoppable. They were able to keep it close against Alabama up until the fourth quarter. They scored more points on Georgia than any other team on their schedule in the regular season. So Tennessee fans are excited about the future because they were winning and they looked really good. So not all 7-5s are created equal. I think that 7-5 is a fine expectation for LSU. Of course, you're going to want to reach for the 9-10 win season stars, but 7-5 is not the end of the world. But 9-10 win season is still probably in the cards, but you cannot win 10 games if you don't win that Florida State game. Looking at LSU's schedule, they start off with Florida State, got Southern, Mississippi State, New Mexico, and then you get into Auburn, Tennessee, Florida, Ole Miss, Alabama, Arkansas. Have a little bit of a breather there with UAB, and then finishing the season off with Texas A&M as they do every year. That is freaking murderer's row. Those are really tough games, and I see a lot of games in there that could easily be swing games. You know, I'm looking at 2 very strong Alabama and Texas A&M teams. While I would love to split those games or win both, hell, reach for the stars, I don't necessarily see that as being, a fair expectation. You know, I'll prepare myself for the worst, but hope for the best. But I look at, Auburn, Tennessee, Florida, Ole Miss, Arkansas. Those could all be very winnable games, but they could also be really difficult games for LSU as well. So getting that first win against Florida State, and Florida State is not a gimme win. You're going to have to win those gimme games. I look at New Mexico and Southern, no disrespect to Southern, UAB, no disrespect to UAB, but those are more so gimme games. That those are, pads on your schedule, and that gives you an automatic, tally in the win column. Florida State's not a gimme game. That's the reason why Florida State is the lone Sunday night game that weekend and Labor Day weekend, is because it's a really fun matchup, because it's going to be a really fun game. So although it's not a gimme game, it's a game you have to win to get that season started the right way, to start to silence doubters early on in the season, to prove that, hey, Brian Kelly can coach LSU. He can do this. He can turn this ship around. And to start the momentum early, because once you get into that murderer's row, you're going to be tired. Your team's going to be injured. And it's going to be just getting hit in the mouth week after week after week. So take the wins where you can get them. So listening to Josh Pate talk about how this is a swing game, I think that it could be. But I think that LSU should win this game. LSU can easily win this game. Like I said, I had the host of Locked on Seminoles on, I believe in June, sometime in June. And they said that their weakest point is the offensive line. And I was kind of chuckled because I think LSU's strongest point is the defensive line. So just, those 2 statements alone, this game is going to be won in the trenches for LSU. It's winnable for LSU. Of course, we don't know who the quarterback is going to be, so that more so defines the offense, not necessarily the success of this team or the potential for success for this team, because they've got 3 or 4, but really 3 really good options. So this game is winnable. They've got to win it. It's a swing game, but they've got to win it. You've got to start this Brian Kelly era off the right way. But what do the sports books say? What are some of the trends that are showing us in Vegas? We'll get into that coming up next. But before I do that, I want to tell you about Bet Online because it is your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports information. I'm about to break down the odds, the lines, the spreads for this LSU Florida State game, and betonline.net has got all of the info that you need to place your money on the Tigers this season. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, Major League Baseball. It's got plenty of bets on the MLB this summer, which has been super fun to put some fun prop bets on the MLB. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information. They've got live betting, esports, and scores. And betonline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. It's a one-stop shop. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite sports and events. They've got MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Which NFL stars move the betting line the most? Starting July 18th on Monday, Locked On gives you the 50 most valuable players in the NFL from the odds makers at BetOnline. Available July 18th on Locked On NFL, wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. I also want to let you all know that today's edition of Locked On LSU is brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. So speaking of betonline.net, which has plenty of your MLB bets for this summer, also, look at some college football or some NFL futures, but looking at some of the college football odds, I want to break down Florida State and LSU's odds because Josh Pate defines this as one of the swing games in the month of September, and I would agree. I don't want it to be that. I want it to be a game where LSU can go in there and absolutely dominate, and that's what everyone, including Vegas, is thinking, but that's just not the reality at this point because there are way too many question marks surrounding this LSU team, at least now. Of course, whenever the starting quarterback is named, which we don't know when that will be, some of those questions will be answered. But I think a lot of the questions about this team will be answered after that game against Florida State. I think that's kind of the good thing about starting your season off not on a cupcake, not on a gimme game, because not only is it more fun, not only do more people want to watch LSU versus Florida State versus, LSU versus East, South, North, South Carolina, Upstate, Technical University, whatever it might be. Not only is it a better product, but it also gives you a better idea of exactly where LSU is at this point. If they absolutely dominate Florida State, then great. That makes you feel comfortable about this team moving forward. But if they fall flat against Florida State, then we are in for a rude awakening throughout the season. But what do the sports books say? Because I wanted to check in on just how much of this game really truly is a swing game. So I checked the sports books, and I would say the overall consensus across several sports books. Of course, BetOnline.net is our official sports book of Locked On LSU. But the general consensus favors LSU by 3. LSU -3, and it's really at even odds. It really truly is a pick'em. It's at LSU -3 at -110 odds, Florida State +3 at -110 odds, and you get into the over/under totals 51.5. So not crazy, not anything outstanding. I don't think they're really expecting any sort of offensive fireworks. Not a 70-80 point over/under. 51.5. They're definitely expecting it to be a ball game. But I look at the money line as well. LSU on the money line, the odds are -155. Florida State on the money line at +120. So it really is, while LSU is favored, and that's a good thing. That can make you feel good about as an LSU fan going into this game, considering there are so many question marks about this team, considering they're going into this game with a first-year head coach versus Florida State with a third-year head coach. They have a little bit more consistency on their side of things, on the Seminoles side of things, but it can make you feel good that at least LSU is favored. But it really is not by much. And I think one interesting aspect of all of this is if you see the trends over the past couple of weeks, then you'll see that the odds opened at -4 and they're down to -3. There are some sports books that have LSU favor -4, and now it's down to -3, down even more to -2.5 on some sports books. I don't look into that too much. I really don't. I think that you can see so much of the shift happen leading up to the game. I think it'll probably stay around that -3, that the spread to be about 3 over the next few weeks, even leading up to the game. I don't think that it's going to be a huge swing one way or another. But I think a lot of people might look at that and say, oh, okay, well, this spread is shrinking. People aren't as high as on LSU. People are awfully bullish on Florida State, whatever that may be. I don't look too far into that. I think it's just overall it's Vegas looking at trends, at betting trends, less about, less of a belief in LSU. But I keep going back to the fact that it's a swing game, and I think the sports books are showing you that it really truly is, because it is close on paper. I mean, compare it to some, cupcake games out there. I don't have the odds up in front of me, but, Alabama Mercer, for example, I don't even think there was a spread on the sports book because it was so high, because it was so ridiculous. And I remember Georgia playing Vanderbilt maybe last year, and the spread was like 35.5. That's a very obvious, one in favor of another. But I mean, this is showing you that it really truly is a swing game, and it just goes to show that I think that we know what Florida State can be, because we've seen what they have been over the past couple of years. So this spread is kind of showing you, while we're giving the benefit of the doubt to LSU, it's not a crazy advantage on one side or the other. So I think that the really interesting thing here will be the future, spreads that come out after that is, going to be completely based on this game against Florida State. So Vegas feeling the exact same way that I kind of do, the same way that Josh Pate just listed out on that audio that I played in the last segment about this being a swing game. I think Vegas is showing you the exact same thing. So coming up next, SEC Media Days kicks off on Monday. Brian Kelly will speak with the media on Monday. I'll actually be in Atlanta for SEC Media Days, and I'm super pumped. But what are our expectations for SEC Media Days? And what can we expect from the three player representatives from LSU? I want to get into that coming up next after a couple words from our sponsors. Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. So SEC Media Days kicks off in Atlanta on Monday, July 18th. I'll be there. Super pumped about it. I'll be sure to have plenty of questions for Brian Kelly. So LSU will bring Brian Kelly in tow. Of course, all SEC coaches will be there in attendance, as well as Jack Bech, BJ Ojular, and linebacker Mike Jones Jr. So what are your expectations, and what do you want to hear? What do you want to get out of this week of SEC Media Days from Brian Kelly and company? I'll preface this by saying SEC Media Days is tough because you kind of get the same information from everyone. It's a whole lot of coach speak. It's a whole lot of optimism. It's a whole lot of we believe in our team and we've been grinding and this summer has shown that this team can overcome adversity, so on and so forth. It's a lot of coach speak. That's exactly what SEC Media Days is, because this is really just an endorsement for each coach, for themselves, for their program, to get the fan base hyped up, to get their players hyped up. It's really just a big ol' endorsement for LSU or whatever team it might be. But I have a few things, a few expectations, and a few things that at least I want to hear from Brian Kelly and Jack Bech and BJ Ojular and Mike Jones Jr. So first and foremost, what I expect Brian Kelly to speak on or to be asked about is, first and foremost, his transition into LSU. How is it, why did you decide to leave Notre Dame? How has the transition been from Notre Dame to LSU? Why did you want to make that move? Things like that. Just kind of overall questions and, kind of easy first year coach questions, especially a move that was so massive and, such just an earthquake in the news side of things, at least. Brian Kelly going from Notre Dame to LSU was a massive move. So I expect plenty of the questions like that. I also expect him to be asked, and this is something that I want to ask Brian Kelly as well, and that's how he's going to fix what went wrong the past 2 years. What did he identify as being the problem in 2020 and 2021? The reason why LSU struggled so badly and had such a hard time winning games. What was the problem there? Was it the coaching staff? And he's not going to tell you, that past coaching staff really mismanaged this talent, but we are doing a great job and we're going to do so much better than them. He's not going to tell you that. But I think that there are a few things that you can kind of look to that you can kind of read between the lines there. If you ask Brian Kelly, what was the problem the past 2 years and what are you going to do to fix it? He'll speak on the coaching staff and how much he believes in the coaching staff and how much he believes in these players and how hard they work and coach speak. But if he does bring up the coaching staff, that to me tells me that they're doing something differently, that this coaching staff is doing something that the past coaching staff didn't. And I think that that kind of goes along with a lot of what we've heard about spring practices and all of these reports that come out about how Brian Kelly conducts himself in practice. And that's incredibly professional, that's incredibly scientific and calculated and organized. And I think that would kind of go hand in hand. So what went wrong the past couple of years, in your opinion? What are you going to do to fix it? Another thing that I think he'll be asked about, and something that I'll also ask him about as well, is recruiting. Because that's been, I mentioned earlier, a red flag or kind of a question mark for a lot of LSU fans is, can he recruit in the South? Can he recruit in Louisiana? And I think that would have been a much more difficult conversation 2 weeks ago than it will be next week, because I mean, LSU recruiting has been on fire over the past couple of weeks, picking up, 4 stars, 5 stars, not just around the country, but around in Louisiana as well. So I do wonder what how the framing of those recruiting questions will go. I intend to ask him something, very not surface level, but something that is very open-ended, I think is more fair to say, something that he can interpret himself. And, I want to hear the behind the scenes of how big of a role he is playing in the recruiting process and how much he's relying on his assistant coaches, especially the ones that have such close ties into the state of Louisiana, and what went wrong with some of those 5 stars and 4 stars that decided to go elsewhere in Louisiana, that decided to go to Alabama or Texas or whatever that might be. What went wrong there? And one annoying thing that I know he's going to be asked about is the dancing. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear about the dancing anymore. The dancing annoys me. It bugs me. I get it. He was dancing with recruits. I get it. The fake Southern accent. I'm over it. But one question that I think will be very interesting that I'm sure will be brought up is the idea of Notre Dame and conferences. I understand Brian Kelly is no longer the head coach at Notre Dame, but that's the biggest question mark in conference realignment is, where will Notre Dame go? What will Notre Dame do? And at this point, he is the one that probably knows the most, other than Marcus Freeman and their athletic director or their president or chancellor, whatever Notre Dame has, of what their plans are and how much they really do truly value being independent. So I think that'll be kind of an interesting peek behind the curtain of Notre Dame. I know that he hasn't been there in the past few months, but he was there for so long. He does understand the ins and outs of Notre Dame and their commitment to being independent, or maybe not commitment to being independent. So I think that'll be another very, very interesting aspect to all of this. But Jack Bech, the player side of things, Jack Bech, BJ Ojular, Mike Jones Jr., I fully expect Jack Bech, and this is kind of what I intend to ask Jack Bech as well, is how he's going to step up in year 2 as being a leader on the offense and how he views his role this year. Because I understand last year, he really broke out in the middle of the season, especially when Kayshon Boutte went down with injury. It was the Jack Bech show. He emerged as being Max Johnson's favorite target. So how has he kind of handled that extra responsibility, and how will he manifest that into a larger role this year in year 2? And being in a duo of Kayshon Boutte and Jack Bech, what are his expectations for himself? How does he feel being in a duo like that? And I think also the quarterbacks, being a wide receiver, that's more important than anything, is who's throwing you the ball. I think it's also a question that's going to be asked to Brian Kelly. And, I understand that BJ Ojular and Mike Jones Jr. are both defensive players, but it does play a very big role for them as well, as who's quarterbacking their teams. So I think that's going to be kind of an overall question for everyone. And it'll be asked to Brian Kelly a lot, and I know it will be, and he probably won't tell you a lot. But I think it'll be really interesting to get a player's perspective, especially a pass catcher's perspective, on not necessarily who the quarterback will be, but how the quarterback competition is unfolding and how he feels about the 3 to 4 options that LSU has in terms of being the starting quarterback in 2022. Now, BJ Ojulari, kind of similar question that I would want to ask Jack Bech on the defensive side of the ball is, how does he feel about being the leader of the defense? Now, BJ Ojulari was one name that I fully expected to be at SEC Media Days. I knew that there wasn't going to be a quarterback, obviously, because there hasn't been one named. I did kind of expect Kayshon Boutte to be in attendance at SEC Media Days, but I understand with him dealing with injury. I get it. I really do get it. And I'm excited to hear from Jack Bech. But I want to ask BJ Ojulari, he will be the leader of this defense. I fully believe that. So how does he feel about that role? How does he want to recreate, his really big breakout season last year, his sophomore season? How does he want to recreate that and build upon that in his junior year. And also his expectations for the defensive line. I said earlier, that is the one area that I feel the most confident about with LSU, is just that monstrous, disruptive, get to the quarterback kind of defensive line. So what are his expectations, and how are they kind of handling that role as being, as winning games in the trenches? Do they expect to do that? Or, what does he want from this defensive line? So I'm excited to hear about that. Honestly, I don't really know what to expect from Mike Jones Jr. Junior linebacker, of course, he transferred into LSU last year from Clemson. So, you might be able to expect some. How does, Brian Kelly compare to Dabo Swinney? How have your experiences at LSU and Clemson been different? What are your expectations for the defense? Things like that. How do you feel about playing in a defense that is notoriously just really damn good year in and year out? Well, that's really, honestly, I don't know what to expect more from Mike Jones Jr. Admittedly, I don't know much about him as a person. I can look at his stats as a player, can understand his impact on the field as a player, but it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say about, the future of this team and their expectations as players for this team. And I think overall for all the players, I think I'm excited to hear about their perspective of how they've seen change over the Brian Kelly era. I don't expect them to give you much about that question, because I'm sure that they have been prepped about, not dissing the former coaching staff or even this coaching staff for that matter, if they don't like it. They've been prepped and groomed on that plenty. But I will be interested to see, just get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain of what they've been thinking, and especially these players they've been in the Coach O era and they're now in the Brian Kelly era. How have things changed? Why are things better? Why are things worse? They're not going to tell you. I don't think they're going to tell you, at least. But it will be interesting to see what they have to say and see if there's any little nuggets that we're able to pull out of that. So, again, SEC Media Days, Brian Kelly and Jack Bech, BJ Ojular, and Mike Jones Jr. will speak on Monday. So I'll have all that content for y'all on Monday. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Like I mentioned, we'll have some recruiting breakdowns. We'll have an SEC Media Days recap on the next episode. But you can make your second listen Locked On SEC. And you can get more on the SEC by making Locked On SEC your second listen. Every day, host Chris Gordy and the local experts of Locked On take you across the SEC in 30 minutes. Make Locked On SEC your second listen.